Hey guys! Tonight, let's tackle one of the most common historical fantasies people have. Oh, if I lived in ancient Rome, I'd totally be a legionary. You wouldn't. You would not last. Not a day. Probably not even until the lunch break, which, by the way, didn't exist. Rome didn't believe in giving you a sandwich break while conquering Gaul. But before we tear this fantasy apart, do the usual. Hit like, subscribe if you enjoy this kind of masochistic walk through history, and tell me in the comments, be honest, how long do you think you'd last? Would you survive the oath? The first march? Or would you fake a limp before breakfast and hope nobody noticed? Let's get you in uniform. Spoiler, it's going to hurt. Imagine applying for a job where you show up naked. That was Roman recruitment. You didn't hand in a resume. You stood there stripped, while some grizzled officer checked your teeth, poked your muscles, and basically decided whether you looked like you'd break before the shovel even touched dirt. The Romans wanted strong backs, good legs, and preferably no obvious medical issues. Flat feet? Bye. Missing teeth? Suspicious. You didn't need brains. Rome had enough brains. They needed bodies. Pass the test, and you'd swear the sacramentum, an oath that basically locked you in for life. It wasn't, I promise to do my best. It was, I swear absolute loyalty, no matter what, even if it kills me, which it probably will. Rome didn't play. Break that oath, and you weren't just fired. You were a criminal against the gods. And if you weren't a citizen? Even better. Rome adored auxiliaries. Non-citizens who signed up for 25 years of service could earn citizenship at the end. That's like a nightmare loyalty program where instead of points, you collect back pain, scars, and chronic trench foot. Once you were in, congratulations. You stopped being yourself. You became a cog. The legion was designed to erase individuality and spit out identical soldiers. Your clothes? Uniform. Your haircut? Standard issue buzz cut. Your living situation? 8 strangers in a leather tent the size of a minivan. They called it the contubernium. You called it, how did my life come to this? Gear wasn't optional. You got a gladius, short stabbing sword, a scutum, massive shield the size of a door, a pilum, throwing spear, and a helmet that made you look like a walking saucepan. Then came the fun part. You had to carry all of it, plus cookware, plus rations, plus tent poles, plus your trusty shovel. That's right. Rome made every soldier his own Home Depot aisle. You were nicknamed Marius Mule, after the reformer who decided soldiers should carry their own gear. Thanks, Marius. Nothing says, glorious warrior of the Republic, like waddling down a dirt road with 80 pounds of junk strapped to your back. Think of the centurion as your boss, except your boss is armed, angry, and legally allowed to beat you. The centurion carried the vitus, a vine staff that served no agricultural purpose. Its job was simple, smacking you when you sneezed, tripped, or just looked slightly too happy. Centurions were veterans. They knew the job. They knew the misery. And they enjoyed making sure you felt it too. Imagine every drill sergeant cliché you've ever seen, then give him legal power to kill you. That's a centurion. And if your unit seriously messed up, Rome had a punishment called decimation. They'd line you up, count every 10th man, and those unlucky guys would be beaten to death by their own comrades. Imagine the world's worst trust fall exercise. That's how Rome built discipline. Now you're in camp. What do you think you're doing? Drinking wine? Chasing glory? You're digging. The Roman legion was basically a giant construction company with swords. Every single night, no matter where you marched, you built a full fortified camp. Trenches, palisades, the whole deal. Then you tore it down in the morning and did it again. Rome, masters of efficiency, destroyers of your lower back. When you weren't digging, you were drilling. Formation practice. Shield drills. Wooden swords heavier than the real ones. Run until your legs hate you. Lift your shield until your arms hate you. Breathe wrong and your centurion hates you. Meals? Forget Michelin stars. Your diet was grain, boiled into porridge, sometimes bread, maybe a scrap of cheese or bacon if you got lucky. The point wasn't taste. The point was not dying of hunger while Rome added another province to its collection. And yes, you slept 8 to a tent. Snoring, farting, lice. You haven't known true human bonding until you've woken up stuck to someone else's sweaty arm in a leather tent with zero ventilation. But the real test wasn't fighting. It was marching. 20 miles a day, in armor, under the sun, carrying everything you owned on your back. No roads? No problem. You'd build one. Uphill? Even better. Rome adored hills. They say an average legionary carried around 80 pounds. That's like hiking with a fridge strapped to your back. Do that for weeks, months, years. And when you arrived, surprise, time to build another camp. Your feet blistered, your shoulders ached, and the centurion was still yelling. You were exhausted, but Rome didn't care. Rome marched. You marched. Where you died. Why you wouldn't survive. Look, I know you think you'd tough it out. Maybe you lift at the gym. Maybe you've run a marathon. That's cute. But could you do it after sleeping in mud, eating barley mush, and being flogged because your shield strap broke? Could you do it knowing that, at any point, your centurion might decide to remind everyone of the joys of discipline by executing your bunkmate? You wouldn't survive. Nobody did. Not really. They endured. That's different. So that's day one. Just day one. And you're already regretting ever fantasizing about this. Because life in the Roman legion wasn't noble or glorious. It was an endless cycle of digging, marching, training, aching, and hoping to live long enough to retire with some land and 2 good legs. Congratulations. You've made it to sunset. Tomorrow? We'll see. You survived your first day barely. You're sore in places you didn't know could be sore, your feet look like they lost a fight with a cheese grater, and you've learned the valuable lesson that barley porridge tastes exactly the same whether it's breakfast, lunch, or dinner. But congratulations, you're still alive, and Rome counts that as a win. Of course, your centurion doesn't care. He's already shouting at you to get moving because today is about discipline, drills, and being broken down into something less like a person and more like a cog in the most terrifying machine the ancient world ever built. The Romans loved discipline the way modern people love coffee. It wasn't optional. It wasn't a treat. It was the entire reason you were even here. The whole system worked because everyone obeyed without question. If the order was to march, you marched. If the order was to dig, you dug. If the order was to stand in a shield wall while angry Germans screamed at you, you held your ground and prayed the gods had good taste in sacrifices. Rome didn't care about your personal bravery. They cared about the formation. The line held or Rome lost. So your days quickly turned into a blur of training so relentless you stopped even thinking about it. Wooden swords heavier than the real ones, because why practice with something manageable when you could practice with something designed to snap your wrists? Shield drills until your arm went numb. Running, marching, hauling, lifting, repeating. You were being programmed, conditioned, reshaped into a soldier who didn't flinch when an arrow whizzed past his ear. And if you did flinch, don't worry, the centurion's vine stick would fix that. Centurions were like human alarm clocks, except instead of ringing, they yelled, and instead of a snooze button, they had a stick. They lived to remind you that your pain didn't matter. They'd stalk the lines of trainees, smacking helmets, shouting insults, promising you that if you didn't do better today, you'd die tomorrow. It was harsh, sure, but it worked. Rome didn't win by being nice. Rome won by grinding every recruit into shape or grinding them into the dirt. And dirt was everywhere. It clung to your skin, filled your boots, coated your gear. You ate dirt, you breathed dirt, you slept in dirt. No matter how many times you washed, and let's be honest, that wasn't often, you always looked like you just wrestled a mud pit. And you smelled worse. Baths came when the campaign schedule allowed, which meant rarely, and when you finally did get one, it wasn't the soothing spa day you imagined. It was you and 100 other unwashed men crowding into a pool of water that instantly turned into a soup of sweat, grime, and enough bacteria to start its own empire. But hygiene was a luxury. You were too busy surviving training to worry about smelling like a dead goat. Rome believed a legionary had to be ready for anything, which meant endless practice in the art of setting up camp. You'd march 20 miles under a blazing sun, dump your gear in exhaustion, and then, surprise, time to build a fortress. Trenches dug, stakes hammered, walls raised. By the time you finished, you were too tired to even complain. And the next morning, you tore it all down and did it again. The food never improved either. Grain was the mainstay, always grain. Sometimes boiled into porridge, sometimes baked into dense loaves of bread, but always bland, always heavy. On rare occasions, maybe some cheese, a scrap of salted pork, or dried fruit. If you were lucky, what? But don't picture fine vintages. Think sour vinegar diluted with water, just enough to keep you from dying of thirst. The miracle wasn't that Rome conquered so much land. The miracle was that they did it while running entirely on barley and self-loathing. And yet, somehow it worked. Slowly, painfully, you began to harden. Your body grew used to the weight. Your feet formed calluses thick enough to scare shoemakers. Your arms stopped trembling every time you lifted the shield. You learned to ignore the hunger, the dirt, the constant ache in your back. Rome didn't care how much it hurt, because hurt meant nothing. Only the legion mattered. The punishments were a constant reminder. If you stepped out of line, you'd be flogged. If you fell asleep on guard duty, you might be executed. If your whole unit performed poorly, you might face decimation, where 1 out of every 10 men was chosen at random to die at the hands of his comrades. Imagine staring at your bunkmates while silently praying the gods found someone else more expendable. That was discipline. That was Rome. But discipline had its rewards. You began to move as one, fight as one, march as one. The formations that looked so impressive from the outside, the tortoise, the shield wall, the wedge, were drilled into your bones. You didn't even think anymore. You heard the horn, you saw the signal, and your body moved before your mind could catch up. That was the beauty of the legion. Not individuals, not heroes, just a wall of men and shields, grinding forward like a human bulldozer. Of course, you still had to actually fight sometimes, and the training only prepared you so much. Battle wasn't orderly. It wasn't clean. It was mud, blood, screams, and chaos. You'd lock shields, brace yourself, and then crash into the enemy like a living avalanche. The gladius wasn't a flashy weapon. It wasn't meant for duels or fancy sword fights. It was short, stubby, designed for stabbing in tight spaces. You weren't Errol Flynn. You weren't swinging in grand arcs. You were jabbing again and again into whatever gap you could find. A belly, a thigh, a throat. And if you hesitated, if you froze for even a second, you were gone. The centurion screamed at you to hold the line. Your comrades screamed as they bled beside you. Arrows whistled overhead. The ground turned slick with blood. You didn't have time to think about glory or empire. You only thought about the next thrust, the next push, the next heartbeat. That was war in the Roman legion. Not noble speeches. Not glorious duels. Just the grinding machinery of death, powered by men too scared of punishment to run and too well trained to falter. And when it was over, if you lived, you went back to camp. You cleaned your gear, you patched your wounds with whatever herbs the medic had, and you ate your barley porridge in silence. Tomorrow, there would be another march, another drill, another ditch to dig. Rome didn't pause. Rome didn't rest. And neither did you. So would you survive? Maybe. For a day. For a week. But 25 years? That was the contract. 25 years of blisters, bruises, barley, and blood. If you made it through, maybe you'd get a patch of land to call your own. Maybe you'd finally breathe free air again. But for most, the legion wasn't a path to glory. It was a slow grind into the dirt, broken bodies left behind while the machine of empire kept rolling forward. And you thought your 9-to-5 was bad. By now, the endless grind of legion life has started to blur together. Days and nights melt into the same loop. March, dig, drill, eat, sleep, repeat. If you ever wondered what it felt like to live as a cog inside a massive machine, congratulations, you don't have to wonder anymore. The legions weren't about individuality. You could have been a farmer, a thief, or the son of a senator when you signed up. The moment you put on the armor, you were stripped of all that. Rome didn't care who you were, only what you could do for the line. Still, small sparks of humanity flickered through. Soldiers weren't robots, and no amount of shouting or beatings could take that away. Around the campfires at night, when the trenches were dug and the watch set, men would trade stories about home, laugh at ridiculous rumors, or play dice with whatever coins they hadn't gambled away the week before. There was singing too, body chants and marching songs, usually half composed on the spot and twice as offensive as they needed to be. Humor was survival. If you couldn't laugh at the absurdity of marching 20 miles in chainmail only to be told you'd built your trench 2 feet too shallow, you'd lose your mind. But Rome made sure you never forgot who was in charge. Centurions were always there, looming in the background, ready to snap you back to order the moment you forgot yourself. Even off duty, they made their presence known, walking the rows, checking weapons, inspecting armor. A dent in your helmet? Punishment. A rusty patch on your sword? Punishment. Forget to clean your boots? You guessed it, punishment. It wasn't that they cared about spotless gear. It was that spotless gear meant discipline, and discipline meant survival. Or at least that's what they told you, right before they smacked you in the head for smiling. Religion was another layer of control. Rome was a deeply superstitious place, and the legion brought that with it everywhere. Before battle, sacrifices were made. Chickens were consulted. Yes, chickens. The sacred birds were fed, and if they ate greedily, the gods were on your side. If they pecked half-heartedly, you braced yourself for a bad day. Imagine betting your life on whether a chicken felt like having breakfast. That was Roman spirituality at work. Soldiers wore charms, prayed to Mars, Jupiter, or whichever local deity they'd picked up along the way, and many believed firmly that victory or defeat hinged on divine whim as much as on the sharpness of their swords. Of course, not everyone bought into it. Cynics muttered that it was all nonsense, that the gods couldn't care less about one scrappy legion in some far corner of the empire. But even the skeptics stayed quiet when the augur declared the omens bad. No one wanted to be the one to tempt fate. And besides, when you were one unlucky stab away from bleeding out in the mud, a little superstition was comforting. If the gods were watching, maybe they'd pick someone else to fall. The physical demands didn't stop either. You'd think after months or even years of training, Rome would let up a little. But no, the drill never ended. Marches grew longer. Packs grew heavier. Rumor had it that a fully loaded legionary carried more weight than a modern soldier, often over 80 pounds of equipment on top of armor and weapons. A man wasn't just a fighter, he was a walking supply chain. You carried your tent, your tools, your rations, and your weapons because Rome had no patience for weaklings. If you collapsed, you slowed the line. And if you slowed the line, you endangered the legion. Which meant you endangered Rome. Which meant, obviously, you deserved another beating. Armor, at least, offered some comfort, though comfort might not be the right word. The famous larica segmentata, those interlocking iron plates strapped around your chest, looked impressive and provided solid protection, but it wasn't exactly breathable. On a hot day, it turned your torso into a portable oven. On a cold day, it trapped damp sweat against your skin until you shivered like a dog in winter. And don't forget the helmet, complete with cheek guards that pinched your face and a neck plate that seemed specifically designed to rub your skin raw. By the end of a long march, you weren't just tired. You were stewing in your own misery. Yet somehow, the armor and weapons gave you pride too. When you lined up with your brothers in arms, shields locked, swords ready, you felt, however briefly, unstoppable. The shield wall was more than just wood and metal. It was a sense of belonging. A sense that, for all the suffering, you were part of something larger than yourself. You weren't a farmer anymore. You weren't a nobody. You were a legionary of Rome, and the world feared you. That pride didn't erase the boredom. Campaigns dragged on. Months of waiting, digging ditches, patrolling empty landscapes, all while rumors swirled about where you'd be sent next. Would it be the forests of Germania, where ghost stories said spirits of the dead still roamed? Or the deserts of Parthia, where the heat cooked men alive in their armor? Or maybe you'd get lucky and be stationed somewhere quiet, like Gaul. Though quiet, in Roman terms, usually meant only a few rebellions this year. When the enemy finally appeared, fear set in. No matter how hardened you thought you were, no matter how many drills you'd endured, battle had a way of shaking your insides loose. The clash of shields, the roar of thousands of men, the earth shaking under stomping feet. It was overwhelming. But discipline carried you through. You didn't run because no one else ran. You didn't falter because you knew the punishment would be worse than the enemy's sword. Fear was beaten into you, but so was obedience. Together they kept you alive. And if you did survive long enough, Rome dangled rewards in front of you like a carrot on a stick. 25 years of service might grant you land, money, or Roman citizenship if you weren't already born with it. The land might be barren, the money barely enough to buy new sandals, but to men who had nothing, it sounded like paradise. Retirement was the dream. You'd sit on your little farm, drink bad wine without a centurion yelling at you, and tell wide-eyed children about the time you marched with the greatest empire in history. You wouldn't tell them about the lice, or the endless porridge, or the blisters that never healed. Memory had a way of polishing the filth into something like glory. But the truth was always harsher. Most men didn't make it to retirement. Disease, exhaustion, and violence took them long before their contracts were up. The army consumed lives the way fire consumes wood, endlessly, hungrily, without remorse. Rome didn't care about the individual. Rome cared about victory. And victory, as far as the empire was concerned, was worth every broken body it took. So when you ask yourself whether you'd survive the legion, don't think of parades, or gleaming armor, or Hollywood-style battles. Think of mud, hunger, exhaustion, and fear. Think of carrying half your body weight in equipment while your centurion screamed at you to march faster. Think of praying to a chicken for a good omen. That was life in the Roman legion. And if you didn't like it, too bad. Rome had no shortage of men willing to take your place. If you ever wondered what the enemy thought when they faced the Roman legion, the answer was usually some flavor of despair. Imagine standing across a field and watching that wall of iron form up, shields snapping into place with perfect precision, the sun glinting off helmets that seemed less like protective gear and more like masks of inevitability. To outsiders, the legion looked less like men and more like a storm rolling toward them, steady, unrelenting, impossible to stop. They weren't wrong. Rome's greatest weapon wasn't the gladius or the pilum. It was discipline, drilled into bone and muscle until men moved as one. But the enemy saw things the soldiers themselves rarely admitted. Behind that wall of iron, men were terrified. Legs shook, mouths went dry. Hands clenched so hard on the hilt of a sword that knuckles went white. For all the bravado, no one knew who would still be standing when the dust cleared. From the outside, the legion looked invincible. From the inside, it was just 1,000 individuals trying not to be the first one to panic. The fighting itself was chaos. Forget the clean Hollywood duels with heroic speeches and elegant swordplay. Real combat was closer to two mobs colliding, hacking, shoving, slipping in mud slick with blood. A legionary thrust his short gladius forward again and again, not swinging wide like in movies, but stabbing, fast, efficient, brutal. It wasn't about looking good. It was about living. You weren't trying to kill the man in front of you with one stroke. You were trying to make him stumble, hesitate, bleed just enough that the man behind you could finish the job. Survival by assembly line. And if you fell, you prayed it was quick. A wound could fester. An arrow in the wrong place, a cut too deep, and infection would set in. Ancient medicine wasn't exactly what you'd call reliable. A doctor might pack the wound with honey or vinegar, stitch you up with crude thread, and hope Mars was in a generous mood. More often than not, you didn't die on the battlefield. You died weeks later, feverish and cursing in a makeshift tent while your comrades pretended not to hear. Disease was the army's silent killer. Camps teemed with thousands of men packed into close quarters, all sharing the same food, water, and latrines. Dysentery, malaria, fevers, they spread faster than gossip. Sometimes whole legions were gutted before they even met the enemy. Imagine being drilled half to death, whipped for slouching, marched across an empire only to be undone by bad soup. That was the reality. And yet, in between the misery, there were small moments that reminded men why they kept going. The taste of bread after a long march. The relief of slipping off your armor at night. A letter from home, rare as it was, carried by Rome's courier system, the closest thing they had to ancient Amazon Prime. Sometimes there were celebrations after a victory, with feasts, wine flowing like water, and songs shouted into the night until voices cracked. Glory might have been fleeting, but for a few hours, it tasted real. The enemies Rome fought were not faceless hordes, though the propaganda painted them that way. Gauls, Germans, Parthians, Britons, each had their own tactics, their own strengths. Some fought with terrifying ferocity, charging headlong into the shield wall. Others relied on cavalry or archers, pelting the Romans from a distance. Rome adapted to each, learning, adjusting, always improving. That was another secret to their success: flexibility. While other armies clung to tradition, Rome absorbed, copied, and perfected whatever worked. If the enemy had a better weapon, Rome stole it. If the enemy had a clever formation, Rome tweaked it until it was theirs. But the soldiers on the ground weren't thinking about strategy. They were thinking about the next meal, the next march, the next punishment. Life in the legion was too immediate to worry about the grand sweep of empire. And yet, every soldier was part of that sweep, whether he liked it or not. Each ditch dug, each road paved, each fort razed, it all expanded Rome's reach. The empire wasn't just built by generals and emperors. It was built by the aching backs of men who would never see their names carved into stone. Punishments hung over everything, a constant shadow. The worst of them, decimation, was more than just brutal. It was psychological warfare against your own unit. If a cohort was judged cowardly or mutinous, every 10th man was executed by his own comrades. Imagine drawing lots, hoping your friends didn't have to beat you to death with clubs because someone else ran in battle. That wasn't just punishment. It was Rome's way of reminding you that you lived or died as a group. Step out of line, and everyone paid. Step together, and maybe you'd see another sunrise. Yet for all the cruelty, many soldiers still found meaning in it. Some genuinely believed they were serving something greater, that Rome's order was worth the cost. Others saw the army as their only way out of poverty, their only chance at land or citizenship. And some, perhaps most, stayed because once you were in, there was no leaving. The legion consumed your youth, your strength, your identity. And by the time it was done with you, if it left you alive at all, there wasn't much left to be anything else. Still, Rome had a way of spinning it. Veterans were paraded as heroes, awarded land, honored with monuments. They became living proof of Rome's greatness, walking advertisements for the glory that awaited those who served. Conveniently, no one mentioned the countless others who didn't make it, whose bones lined forgotten roadsides or whose graves were never dug. The empire loved victory. It had no use for tragedy. That's the contradiction at the heart of the legion. On one hand, it was misery incarnate: sweat, blood, fear, and endless toil. On the other hand, it was the backbone of one of history's greatest empires, the force that carved roads and cities and borders that still shape our world. Without the legion, Rome was nothing. With it, Rome was unstoppable. At least until it wasn't. Empires rise, empires fall, and somewhere in the middle are ordinary men carrying impossible loads, marching toward futures they'll never see. So when you picture yourself in the Roman legion, don't imagine the parades or the statues. Imagine mud caked on your sandals, the stench of sweat and smoke in your nose, a centurion's voice screaming in your ear. Imagine stabbing into a shield wall while praying a chicken's appetite wasn't lying. That was the legion. Not glory, not honor, just survival, one brutal day after another, in service of a machine that cared for Rome but never for you. You've survived more battles than you can count, more marches than you'd care to remember, and more barley porridge than any human stomach should reasonably endure. Somehow, against the odds, you're still alive. Congratulations. Rome has chewed you up, spat you out, and yet you're still on your feet. That means you're starting to think about the unthinkable: retirement. Yes, there was such a thing, though the word didn't mean sipping wine on a villa terrace while humming Carpe Diem. Retirement meant you made it through 25 grueling years of service without being skewered, starved, decimated, or stabbed in the back by food poisoning. Already that put you in a very exclusive club. And what did you get for it? Land if you were lucky. The pension maybe. A plot somewhere in the provinces, often in lands Rome had recently conquered, because nothing says, "Thank you for your service," like settling you among the very people you'd spent decades killing. Here you go, soldier, enjoy this new farm. The neighbors may hate your guts, but the soil's fertile and the taxes will ruin you. It wasn't glamorous, but it was better than dying in the mud. Religion was always a part of legion life, not because Rome was especially pious but because soldiers would cling to anything that might improve their chances. Omens, sacrifices, auspicious chicken pecking. Yes, that was real. Before battle, priests would bring out sacred chickens. If the birds ate greedily, it meant victory. If they sulked and refused food, it meant the gods were grumpy. Sometimes, when the chickens weren't cooperative, officers would accidentally toss them into the sea and declare that drowning was technically a sign they'd been full already. When your life depended on poultry, you learned to be flexible. Superstition and ritual followed you everywhere. Soldiers wore amulets against curses, invoked Mars and Jupiter, muttered prayers before marching out. Some even carved protective spells into their gear, little reminders that maybe the gods weren't too busy to notice. And when someone did die, there were rites to keep their restless spirit from haunting the camp. Imagine being so tired you still had to worry about being haunted by Steve from tent number 6 because no one poured out enough wine for his soul. Legion life didn't stop being stressful just because you were dead. And yet, for all the misery, Rome managed to make the Legion feel like a family. Not the warm, loving kind. More like a dysfunctional one where your older brother constantly hit you with a stick and your father expected you to dig trenches every night. But still a family. You ate together, slept together, fought together. You shared jokes, insults, stories from home. You learned which of your tent mates snored like thunder, which stole extra rations, which would cover for you when you slipped up. In that bond, there was some comfort. If nothing else, you weren't suffering alone. Of course, the bond only carried you so far. There was always the shadow of discipline, always the reminder that Rome cared about the machine, not the man. You were replaceable. Thousands stood ready to fill your place. That knowledge shaped everything. It taught you not to dream too big, not to hope for too much, not to believe the rhetoric about eternal glory. The empire was eternal. You were not. But still, men dreamed. They dreamed of farms, of families, of walking into a town square not as an anonymous soldier but as a veteran, respected, maybe even feared. Veterans had weight in Roman society. They were symbols of the empire's strength, walking reminders of the price of power. People looked at them and saw Rome itself, carved into muscle and scar. Even emperors paid attention to them, because a disgruntled veteran population was the kind of thing that could topple thrones. So yes, veterans mattered, even if most of them were too exhausted to enjoy it. And what about glory? That word gets tossed around a lot in stories, in epics, in monuments. The reality was muddier. Glory was rare, fragile, and almost always claimed by someone else. Generals got the triumphs. Emperors got their statues. You got a scar across your cheek and maybe a coin tossed into your hand if you were lucky. And yet, when bards and poets sang of Rome's victories, they sang of you, not by name of course, but of the anonymous wall of iron that held the line, that pushed forward, that conquered. You became part of something vast, something that outlived you. Maybe that was enough. The legacy of the Legion wasn't just in the battles won. It was in the roads that crisscrossed Europe, many of which still exist today. It was in the camps that became towns, the forts that grew into cities. Every time you swung a pickaxe, every time you shoveled dirt, you were laying the foundation of a world that would echo for millennia. At the time, it felt like pointless drudgery. In hindsight, it was civilization in the making. The enemies remembered too. For centuries after, tales were told of the implacable Roman war machine, of men who marched like iron and fought like machines. Some hated Rome for it. Some admired them. Many both. That was the paradox. The same legion that crushed rebellion also brought roads, baths, and trade. Conquerors and builders, destroyers and civilizers, all wrapped in one. But back in your sandals, none of that mattered. What mattered was surviving today and tomorrow and the day after that. What mattered was whether your sandals would last the next march, whether your stomach would stop growling, whether your centurion would finally stop shouting. Grand legacies were nice for poets. You were too busy trying not to die of dysentery. So, Would you have survived a day in the Roman legion? Maybe. But a lifetime? That was another question. Few did. And those who made it carried the weight of it forever. The scars, the nightmares, the memories of friends lost and enemies faced, those never left. Rome might reward you with land or money, but it never gave you back what you lost along the way. Still, when you squint at the ruins of Roman roads, when you walk through the remnants of old forts, when you see the lines of history carved into the land, you can almost hear it. The tramp of sandals, the clash of shields, the bark of a centurion's orders. The legion lives on, not in glory, not in statues, but in the memory of ordinary men who marched further, fought harder, and endured more than seems humanly possible. And with that, maybe it's time to leave the campfires behind, wipe the sweat and blood from your brow, and shift our gaze elsewhere. Because while the Roman legion was busy grinding Europe into submission, across the seas and centuries, another figure was setting out on a journey so improbable it sounds like fiction. His name was Marco Polo, and unlike you, he didn't spend his life being screamed at by centurions. He spent it walking, riding, and sailing across half the known world, telling stories so wild that people back home thought he'd lost his mind. Picture yourself waking up at dawn, not in your comfortable bed, but inside a cramped leather tent that smells faintly of damp wool, sweat, and last night's gruel. 6 or 7 other men are sprawled beside you, most of them snoring like clogged drains, one grinding his teeth so loudly you wonder if he's trying to chew his way through sleep. You roll off your straw pallet, brush off a few stubborn fleas who treat you like their Airbnb, and step into the chilly morning air. There is no coffee. There is no croissant. There is no gentle good morning from anyone. What there is instead is a horn blast and a centurion already barking at you to form up because apparently, in the Roman legion, nobody gets to ease into their day. You either move or you move faster. The day always starts with drills, because the Romans believed in one guiding principle. If you repeat something until your body aches, your mind stops complaining and your enemy will eventually stop breathing. The training yard, if you can call it that, is just dirt, sweat, and pain. You don't practice with light wooden toys. You're given weapons deliberately heavier than the real ones. That's right, your gladius, short and sharp, already feels like a medieval dumbbell, but the training version is even worse, because why not build extra misery into the routine? The shields, too, are twice the weight of battle shields. You practice slashing, stabbing, and blocking for hours, until your arms go numb and your hands blister, because the Roman commanders had figured out that if you can swing a training sword heavier than your opponent's head, you'll have no trouble when the real fight comes. But the agony doesn't stop at swordplay. You also practice throwing the pilum, the Roman javelin designed with a clever, cruel twist. Once it hit a shield, the long iron shank bent on impact, making the shield awkward to carry and impossible to reuse. The unlucky enemy had to toss away his only defense and stand there exposed like a bad extra in a gladiator movie. To get good at this, you practice for hours, and if you miss your mark, the centurion lets you know with a glare that makes you wonder whether death on the battlefield might actually be preferable. Marching drills follow. If you thought walking was simple, think again. Romans didn't just walk. They marched 30 kilometers a day with 40 kilos of gear strapped across their backs. Cloak, rations, tools, cooking pots, spare sandals, stakes for building camp palisades, the works. You basically carry a small house on your shoulders, and you are expected to keep formation the entire time. No stragglers, no complaining, no bathroom breaks. Just synchronized misery under the Mediterranean sun. And just when you think you might collapse from exhaustion, you arrive at your destination, which turns out to be the middle of nowhere. Do you rest? Of course not. You build a fort. Every night. Digging trenches, setting palisades, hammering stakes, arranging tents. It's like camping, except instead of marshmallows and ghost stories, you get calluses and chronic back pain. And if you thought the centurion would pat you on the back after all that, you'd be wrong. These men, scarred veterans with voices like gravel, carried the infamous vitus, a vine staff used not for decoration but for beating sense, or rather obedience, into the ranks. A soldier who fell behind, who dared to yawn, who let his shield sag an inch, might find himself tasting the sting of the vitus across his back. And if a whole cohort misbehaved or showed cowardice, then came decimation, the kind of punishment that sounds like something out of a horror film but was all too real. 1 in 10 men would be chosen by lot to be executed by their comrades. Nothing like murdering your bunkmate with a club to remind you never to run from a fight again. It was discipline by terror, and the Romans wielded it like an art form. Food wasn't much of a comfort either. You ate what the supply wagons could manage to deliver: barley porridge, maybe a chunk of cheese if you were lucky, bread so hard you could file your nails on it, and the occasional strip of salted pork. Olive oil and vinegar were the only luxuries, if you can call sour vinegar a luxury. Sometimes, on campaigns, you had to forage or raid the countryside, because starving men don't fight well, and Rome knew it. But forget feasts, forget comfort food. Your diet kept you alive, barely, and left you dreaming of figs you'd never taste again. The drills, the marching, the endless fort building, this was daily life. And yet, behind the cruelty, the monotony, and the exhaustion, there was method. Rome's legions weren't just tough, they were machines. The individual didn't matter. You were part of a block, a wall of shields and spears, and when your centurion shouted, "Testudo," you slammed your shield over your head and pressed against your brothers until you became a living tank. Enemy arrows rained down, but you barely flinched. You were not a man anymore. You were Rome, breathing, sweating, bleeding, advancing. And that, in the eyes of your commanders, was worth every blister, every lash, every drop of sweat. But don't think for a second that danger came only from the enemy. Disease was everywhere. Dysentery, fevers, infected wounds, these killed more legionaries than swords ever did. The medical care was primitive, though the Romans were better than most. They had field surgeons who carried scalpels, bandages, and ointments. But surgery without anesthesia is just medieval torture with paperwork. Imagine lying there, wide awake, while someone saws off your infected limb, all while your comrades hold you down and tell you not to squirm. Congratulations, you survived the battle but lost your leg to the cure. And yet, for all the suffering, the brutality, the endless grind, many legionaries stayed in service for decades. Because if you lived long enough to retire, you got land, money, and citizenship if you weren't already Roman. You could go from dirt-poor farmer's son to respected landowner. That carrot dangled at the end of the stick kept countless men in line. Well, that and the fear of decimation. At night, when the campfires glowed and the sentries paced, you might look up at the stars and wonder if the gods cared. Legionaries carried amulets, prayed to Mars, muttered superstitions before battle. Some even believed the gods walked with them, guiding their pilum, shielding their bodies. Maybe faith was the only thing that kept them sane. Or maybe it was the wine, sour but effective at dulling the ache in your bones. So, would you survive in the Roman legion? Probably not. You'd collapse on the first march, complain about the food, forget your shield in a ditch, and get yourself beaten by the Vitus before noon. And even if by some miracle you made it through the day, you'd still have 24 more years of service to go. 24 years of mud, blood, drills, and centurions with bad tempers. But if you lasted, if you endured, you'd retire with scars, stories, and maybe even a little patch of land to call your own. You wouldn't be the same person who marched in. You'd be harder, leaner, a fragment of the great Roman war machine. And that machine, brutal and efficient, was what carved an empire out of the ancient world. By now you've survived drills, marches, starvation-level rations, punishments that make boot camp look like summer camp, and the kind of back pain chiropractors would salivate over. But of course, the Romans hadn't dragged you across miles of dust and mud just so you could practice thrusting your wooden sword at a straw dummy until your shoulders snapped. No, the whole point of turning you into a human ox with blisters was to send you into battle, shoulder to shoulder with thousands of other poor souls who also signed away their youth for a chance at glory, or at least survival. So imagine it, the horns blaring in the distance, the centurion shouting orders with lungs that could probably shatter glass, and the ground trembling under the synchronized stomping of thousands of sandals. Your heartbeat is already a drumline, your stomach twisting itself into knots, and you're clutching your scutum, the great rectangular shield, as if it were your mother's hand on the first day of school. Except this school has arrows, cavalry, and people who want to reduce you to decorative mulch. The formation tightens. You feel your comrades pressing in against your sides, sweat mingling with sweat, shields clashing together until you become part of a single wall. The Roman testudo, the tortoise, unfolds with eerie precision, shields raised overhead, shields locked in front, every man hiding behind wood and iron. It's claustrophobic, dark, and hot, like being packed inside a barrel with 90 other terrified pickles. The sound of arrows raining down is more terrifying than any thunderstorm you've ever heard, a constant rattle of iron against shields. Some strike home. Someone screams. But you keep moving forward, step after step, because the man next to you is moving forward, and the one behind you is pushing, and the centurion has made it perfectly clear that stepping backward is less healthy than being impaled. When the testudo finally breaks open and you charge, the world explodes into chaos. The gladius, that short stabbing sword everyone mocked for being unimpressive compared to barbarian broadswords, suddenly makes perfect sense. You don't swing it like a hero in a movie. You stab. Quick, brutal, efficient. Shield slam, step forward, stab. Over and over. It's a rhythm, an awful heartbeat of violence. The enemy shouts, your comrades grunt, the clatter of iron fills your ears, and the air itself stinks of blood, sweat, and fear. If you're lucky, you don't even remember the details. You just remember the weight in your arm, the burn in your lungs, the splatter across your face when someone too close loses. People imagine ancient battles as elegant clashes, two armies charging dramatically across a field. In reality, it was a meat grinder. Men slipping on mud and gore, tripping over bodies, hacking blindly at whatever moved. There's no dignity in it, just survival. And in the middle of that nightmare, you cling to your training like it's the only rope keeping you from drowning. Drill, march, stab. Shield up, thrust forward, don't break rank. That's what makes the Roman legion terrifying. Not individual brilliance, but collective stubbornness. The enemy might scream louder, swing harder, or outnumber you, but Rome kept pressing forward like a hydraulic press with sandals. The danger doesn't end when the horns finally blow to signal victory. If you're wounded, you hope it's something simple, like a cut or a bruise. Because if you catch an arrow in your thigh or a spear in your gut, the medicus will do his best with iron instruments, wine for sterilizing, and maybe a prayer to Aesculapius. But there's no guarantee you'll see the next sunrise. And if you're not injured, congratulations. You get to help dig trenches for the dead, strip the fallen of weapons, or construct yet another fort to sleep in. Victory in the Roman world is measured not in cheers, but in the fact that you're still breathing and carrying a shovel. But let's not forget the flip side, glory. That mythical prize dangled in front of you like a carrot tied to a very long stick. Survive a battle, and you might get a share of the spoils, coins, jewelry, maybe a new cloak taken off some unlucky barbarian. Do well enough, and your name might be remembered in the official records, or your commander might actually thank you, which in Roman terms is about as common as free Wi-Fi in the desert. There were triumphs, of course, glorious parades through Rome where generals basked in public adoration. You wouldn't be the star of the show, of course, but you could say you'd been there, part of the machine that crushed another enemy into submission. Still, for every soldier who dreamed of riches, there were plenty who just dreamed of surviving long enough to retire. 20 years in service if you were lucky, 25 if you weren't. That's 2 decades of bruises, beatings, and the occasional decimation if your cohort angered the wrong man. But make it to the end, and you could receive land, money, and if you weren't Roman by birth, citizenship. It was Rome's way of saying, thanks for all the stabbing. Here's a plot of farmland. Try not to die of old age. Religion and superstition threaded through all of it. Before battles, augurs watched birds to see if the gods were in the mood to bless your slaughter. Soldiers carried amulets, whispered prayers, or performed little rituals to keep death at bay. Maybe you'd kiss a charm before throwing your pilum, or rub lucky dust into your sandals. Anything to convince yourself the universe was on your side. And when the fighting stopped, when night fell and the fires burned, you'd sit with your comrades, sharing sour wine and stories. You'd laugh even if the laughter was shaky. You'd remember the faces of those who didn't make it. You'd scratch at the flea bites and stretch your sore muscles, And you'd wonder if this was worth it. Was the glory of Rome worth the bruises on your body and the blood on your hands? The truth is, probably not. You wouldn't survive it. Not one day, not one march, not one battle. And even if you did, the experience would carve you into something unrecognizable, a man forged not by choice but by discipline and necessity. And that's exactly how Rome built an empire, one terrified recruit at a time, hammered into iron by fear, hunger, and endless drills. You'd think after all that marching, stabbing, and surviving fleas the size of pigeons, you'd get a break. Maybe a comfy chair, maybe some downtime, maybe even a snack. But no, Rome was never a civilization big on self-care. And since you've had your fill of mud, blood, and bad wine, let's pivot to someone who lived a life almost completely opposite to the legionary. Instead of sleeping in a tent full of sweaty comrades, he lounged in palaces. Instead of carrying 80 pounds of gear, he carried stories. And instead of dying anonymously in some forgotten battlefield, his name got printed in books, whispered across Europe, and eventually helped inspire other lunatics to sail into the unknown. Yes, we're talking about Marco Polo. Marco Polo's story starts not with him, but with his family, a family that apparently couldn't sit still. Born in Venice in 1254, Marco was the son of a merchant, which already set the stage for a life of counting coins, measuring spices, and haggling with people over things like silk, jewels, and if the deal went south, your sanity. His father, Niccolò, and Uncle Maffio were the kind of guys who looked at a map, saw a blank space, and thought, "Perfect, let's risk dysentery and bandits." By the time Marco was a teenager, his dad had already traveled east, met Kublai Khan, the Mongol ruler of basically everything from Beijing to don't even ask how far, and decided Venice was boring. When Marco was about 17, the Polo trio, father, uncle, and wide-eyed teenager, set off to see the Khan again. But this wasn't just any road trip. Forget smooth highways and roadside motels. Their path was the Silk Road, thousands of miles of deserts, mountains, and oases, punctuated by the occasional bandit who viewed merchants like you view unattended Amazon packages. They started with a blessing from the Pope, because apparently having God on your side was considered important insurance, and then trudged east through places that most Europeans couldn't even pronounce, let alone imagine. Picture it, endless deserts where the sun burned hotter than your mom's stove when she forgets the pan, followed by icy mountains where you wondered why human knees bend at all. Marco saw the Pamir Mountains, so high and barren they made you question whether the gods had misplaced a chunk of creation. He crossed lands of strange customs. People who drank mare's milk, people who cooked with spices Venetians had only smelled in dreams, people whose languages sounded like riddles and songs mixed together. And he kept notes. Mental notes, sure, but vivid enough that later, when he finally told his story, Europeans thought he was either a liar or the world's bravest travel blogger. After 3 years of this endurance marathon, the Polos reached their destination, Kublai Khan's court. Now, if you've been imagining Marco trudging into some mud hut, forget it. This was Xanadu, or Xanadu, where luxury was the baseline. Silk everywhere, palaces the size of small towns, banquets with more food than Rome could feed an army, and of course, Kublai Khan himself. The man was not some barbarian king chewing on bones. He was sophisticated, politically savvy, and curious. He wanted to know everything about Europe, about Christianity, about why Venice mattered. And Marco, a teenager who just had the adventure of a lifetime, suddenly found himself as one of the Khan's favorites. From there, Marco became more than a guest. He was a sort of emissary, translator, observer, and occasional spy. Kublai sent him on missions across the empire, and Marco wrote, or later dictated, about wonders no Venetian had seen before. Cities with canals like veins through marble skin. Paper money, which seemed like wizardry to Europeans used to lugging around coins. An empire so well connected it made Roman roads look like gravel driveways. They had relay stations, messengers, and horses so fast it was basically the Amazon Prime of the 13th century. Order something in Beijing, and it could be halfway across the empire before you even remembered you wanted it. Marco visited provinces most Europeans couldn't place on a map. He traveled to Yunnan, where elephants roamed and strange gems sparkled. He described India, its spices and its elephants draped in armor. He even claimed to have seen unicorns, though by unicorns, he meant rhinos, which is sort of like mistaking a cow for a dragon because you saw it through dirty glasses. Still, his descriptions of the East filled with details, some accurate, some exaggerated, some flat-out bizarre, painted a world so rich that Europeans who read them thought he'd either discovered a paradise or made the whole thing up. But no guest of the Khan could stay forever. After nearly 2 decades of service, the Polos begged for permission to return home. The excuse? An escort mission. They were tasked with bringing a Mongol princess by sea to Persia for marriage. Which sounded romantic until you realized the trip involved storms, disease, shipwrecks, and the kind of body count that would make a horror director blush. By the time they limped back to Venice, Marco was middle-aged, full of stories, and probably smelled like a mix of salt, sweat, and regret. Back in Venice, Marco's life still wasn't peaceful. He got caught in a war between Venice and Genoa, thrown into prison, and ended up dictating his travel tales to his cellmate, Rustic Hello. The result? The Travels of Marco Polo, a book that was part encyclopedia, part fairy tale, and part you had to be there. He wrote about cities glimmering with wealth, rulers with armies larger than Europe could dream of, and customs so strange they bordered on fantasy. Europeans ate it up, though many doubted him. When asked on his deathbed to admit he'd exaggerated, Marco supposedly said, "I have not told half of what I saw." Which is the historical equivalent of dropping the mic. His book didn't just entertain, it inspired. Columbus carried a copy on his voyages. Mapmakers sketched lands they hadn't seen based on his words. He widened the European imagination, planting seeds of curiosity, greed, and ambition. So, what did Marco Polo really leave behind? Not just tales of palaces and paper money, but the idea that the world was bigger, stranger, and more connected than anyone in Europe realized. He turned curiosity into fuel, and even if some of his unicorns were rhinos, the fact remains. He made people look outward instead of inward. And that shift, that hunger for more, would shape centuries of exploration, conquest, and, unfortunately, colonization. But let's not ruin the mood. For now, let's just marvel at the fact that a teenager from Venice went further than most people today ever will, without GPS, without flight points, and without even a decent pair of sneakers. So there you are, a Venetian merchant's kid who somehow went from smelling fish guts on the docks of Venice to rubbing elbows with the most powerful ruler on the planet. And Kublai Khan doesn't just pat you on the head and say, "Nice tunic, kid." He actually gives you jobs, missions, assignments. You're essentially an unpaid intern for the Mongol Empire, except your resume builder involves riding for weeks across landscapes that make death seem like a casual possibility. Imagine the prestige of being trusted by the Khan himself. And now imagine the blisters, dysentery, and cultural misunderstandings that come with that honor. Marco didn't just sit around admiring silk curtains. He traveled. A lot. Kublai sent him to Yunnan, the lush southern reaches of China where elephants roamed like living bulldozers and the jungles whispered with strange birds. To Marco, who grew up in a city where pigeons are the main wildlife, this was like stepping into a fantasy novel. He marveled at the gemstones locals pulled from the ground, the spices that clung to the air, and the food that was so spiced and colorful it probably made Venetian bread soup look like prison gruel. He learned to observe carefully, noting customs, describing architecture, noticing how different regions tied themselves into the Mongol network. And that network really was something. The Mongols had built a communication system that functioned like the internet with hooves. Riders sped between relay stations carrying messages faster than most Europeans could deliver a loaf of bread across town. Marco describes it in wide-eyed detail. Stations with fresh horses, stocked with food, and a system so efficient it makes your country's postal service look like a sloth trying to do calculus. Need to send a note across thousands of miles? Done. This was empire as logistics, and Marco, future hype man for the Silk Road, soaked it all in. He also observed cities that made Venice look provincial. Khanbalik, the capital, later Beijing, was vast, filled with canals, markets, and people from all corners of the empire. It wasn't just a city, It was a performance, a statement of power and wealth. Xanadu, known to poets as Xanadu, dazzled him with gardens, hunting grounds, and palaces shimmering with gilded splendor. He wasn't just a tourist, he became a storyteller, storing details for later that would make European readers gape. Paper money, for example. Europeans couldn't wrap their heads around it. Imagine trying to explain a credit card to someone who thinks coins are the only real money. Marco described notes stamped with official seals, backed by the Khan's authority, circulating across markets like magic. Europeans thought he was lying, because obviously, no empire could trust people with slips of paper. Jokes on them. Then there were his tales of strange creatures. The rhinoceros became his infamous unicorn, except instead of the graceful, virgins-only fantasy horse Europeans dreamed about, Marco described a squat, grumpy animal that looked like it had crawled out of a hangover. He didn't always get it right, but his attempts to explain the unfamiliar gave Europeans their first glimpse into a larger, weirder world. His assignments weren't all sightseeing. He claimed to have traveled as far as India, where he described pearls, spices, and monkeys trained to collect coconuts. He may have exaggerated. Marco had a flair for embellishment, but he painted a picture of Asia that was richer and more expansive than anything Europeans imagined. Even if he sometimes confused hearsay with experience, the breadth of his vision reshaped how people thought about geography. Of course, not everything was glamorous. Travel was punishing. Roads turned to rivers during the rainy season. Mountains loomed, snow-choked and deadly. Deserts stretched endlessly, where mirages taunted the thirsty and the stars mocked you with their cold clarity. Bandits lurked, smelling weakness and wealth. Diseases crept in silently, felling men as quickly as arrows. For every glittering city Marco described, there was probably a week of misery, trudging along, hoping the horse didn't collapse beneath you. And still he carried on, absorbing, observing, surviving. After nearly 2 decades in service, the Polos were desperate to go home. Imagine being gone for 24 years. You leave as a teenager and come back middle-aged, with a beard, scars, and stories so outrageous nobody believes them. But leaving wasn't simple. You don't just pack up and wave goodbye to Kublai Khan. You need an excuse, and in their case, it was escort duty. They were tasked with delivering a Mongol princess to Persia for marriage. On paper, noble and honorable. In practice, a death cruise. The voyage took 2 years, saw storms and shipwrecks, and killed most of the passengers, leaving only a handful alive to stagger into Persia. Marco survived, because apparently destiny liked a good storyteller. When they finally limped back to Venice, the Polos were so unrecognizable that even their relatives thought they were imposters. Imagine being gone so long that your neighbors don't know you anymore. They proved their identities by cutting open their old travel clothes, which they had stuffed with gems like human piñatas. Suddenly, everyone listened. These weren't just wanderers. They were men who had seen things no one else had seen, and they were rich enough to prove it. But Marco's adventures weren't over. Caught in a war between Venice and Genoa, he was imprisoned. And here's where fate handed him a pen, or at least a writing partner. In his cell, Marco met Rustichello, a romance writer who knew how to spin a tale. Together, they crafted Marco's stories into The Travels of Marco Polo. It wasn't dry geography, it was a blend of fact, wonder, and embellishment. Europeans devoured it. Some called him a liar. Others were captivated. Either way, he had their attention. His book painted Asia as a land of marvels. Palaces gleaming with wealth, armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, and customs so alien they bordered on the magical. Did Marco exaggerate? Probably. Did he invent whole sections? Possibly. But what mattered wasn't accuracy, it was imagination. He cracked open Europe's mind and poured in visions of a world larger, richer, and more bizarre than they ever conceived. When asked on his deathbed to admit that he had stretched the truth, Marco supposedly replied, "I have not told half of what I saw." Which is either the greatest flex in travel writing history or the slyest way of dodging an awkward confession. Either way, his legacy was secured. Because here's the thing, Marco's tales lit a fuse. Explorers like Columbus carried copies of his book, treating it like a guidebook to Asia. Mapmakers sketched coastlines they had never seen, filling gaps with guesses and Polo's descriptions. Merchants dreamed of spices, silk, and gold. The world felt bigger, and suddenly, everyone wanted a piece of it. Marco Polo didn't conquer lands with a sword. He conquered imaginations with words. And in the long run, that proved just as dangerous, because it sent Europeans chasing horizons, changing the course of history. And speaking of horizons, how about we look at what fueled those soldiers, those merchants, and those everyday Romans back home? Not dreams of empires or exotic palaces, but food. Street food, to be exact. Because while Marco Polo was tasting delicacies in the East, average Romans were stuffing their faces with dishes that would make modern fast food look tame. Want to dive into a thermopolium and see what counted as a snack in ancient Rome? Imagine the return journey of Marco Polo, after decades in lands that seemed more like fever dreams than earthly kingdoms. You might think he would be carried home in triumph, showered with gold, serenaded by choirs. But this is Venice, and Venice is not sentimental. Venice is a merchant with its hand out. Marco, his father Niccolò, and his uncle Maffeo had to claw their way back not in a glorious parade, but on a voyage that was essentially a diplomatic delivery service. They were tasked with escorting a Mongol princess, Kakachin, by sea to Persia, where she was promised in marriage. Romance? Not really. More like Amazon Prime with human cargo. The journey, however, was anything but express shipping. Storms, pirates, starvation, disease. This wasn't a cruise line with cocktails by the pool. By the time they reached Persia, most of the travelers were dead. Kakachin survived, barely, which must have been awkward at her wedding when she realized her entourage had turned into corpses. The Polos eventually dragged themselves back to Venice around 1295, only to find themselves unrecognizable. They had been gone for 24 years. Picture your neighbors vanishing when you were in grade school, then showing up in your midlife with bags of jewels, silk, and stories about people who use paper as money. At first, no one believed them. Their own relatives thought they were imposters. Legend says the Polos hosted a dinner where they wore tattered clothes and looked pitiful, then suddenly ripped them open to reveal stitched-up linings stuffed with jewels. A dramatic reveal, like a medieval unboxing video, proving they weren't lunatics but the real, absurdly wealthy deal. But Venice wasn't exactly at peace. Not long after Marco's return, the city clashed with rival Genoa in a brutal naval war. Marco Polo was captured and thrown into a Genoese prison. Yes, after surviving deserts, mountains, Mongols, and monsoons, the man was taken down not by exotic dangers but by Venetian politics. Yet it was in prison that his legacy truly began. There he met Rustichello of Pisa, a romance writer with a taste for flair and embellishment. Together they wrote down Marco's tales, which became known as the Travels of Marco Polo. This was not a sober historical document with footnotes. This was Game of Thrones meets Lonely Planet. Rustichello massaged Marco's memories into something marketable, part travelogue, part myth, part gossip magazine. The book described wonders like cities of 1 million people, black stones that burned hotter than wood, coal, and unicorns that were, in fact, Indian rhinoceroses. Marco said they weren't pretty, unlike the delicate creatures from European myth. Thanks, Marco, for shattering childhood dreams with a fat, grumpy rhino. The book was devoured across Europe. Readers were astonished. Imagine being told in the 13th century that entire empires ran on paper money, that roads stretched farther than Roman highways, and that there were creatures like crocodiles large enough to eat men. To many Europeans, Marco's descriptions were fantastical, unbelievable. Some dismissed them as lies, others as exaggerations. Critics pointed out he never mentioned the Great Wall of China, as if one missing tourist attraction invalidated the rest. But whether truth or tall tale, the book sparked imaginations. It became a medieval bestseller, copied by hand, whispered about by scholars, mocked by skeptics, and ultimately impossible to ignore. When Marco Polo finally died in 1324, he was asked to recant his stories. Admit it, they urged him, you made it up. But according to tradition, his last words were, I have not told half of what I saw. which is the perfect mic drop for a man whose reputation was built on stretching the boundaries of believability. Whether you think him a visionary explorer or a master storyteller doesn't really matter. His book expanded the European imagination. It pulled minds outward, toward Asia, toward trade, toward possibilities. It was the travel vlog of its time, except handwritten and prone to confusing unicorns with rhinos. And the ripple effects were huge. Christopher Columbus carried a copy of the travels when he sailed west, convinced he could reach Asia. Mapmakers annotated margins with Marco's stories, whether they were plausible or not. He made distant places seem tantalizingly real. Spices, silk, gold, all shimmering just beyond the horizon. His exaggerations didn't matter because they planted the idea that the world was larger, richer, stranger than anyone dared imagine. In that sense, Marco Polo was less a tour guide and more a dream salesman. He sold the possibility of a globalized world centuries before globalization had a name. It's easy to be cynical now. We can fact-check, we can scroll Wikipedia, we can argue in comments about whether Marco Polo was a fraud. But in the 13th and 14th centuries, he was a lightning bolt. A man who convinced Europe that there was more out there, and that it was worth chasing, even if the chasing meant getting shipwrecked, imprisoned, or laughed at. His survival, his stories, and his audacity to spin them changed history in a way few prisoners of war can claim. You wouldn't survive a day in the Roman legion, sure. But you also probably wouldn't survive 24 years of deserts, Mongol diplomacy, and Genoese prison. Marco Polo did, and he left behind a book that still lingers like an echo of the world's first great influencer. Picture yourself walking through the streets of ancient Rome. It isn't marble and perfection like the postcards. They didn't have postcards anyway. It's crowded, noisy, smelly, and alive. The air is thick with smoke from cooking fires, the shouting of hawkers, the clang of metal, the creak of carts, the occasional scream of someone being robbed. And then there's the smell. Oh, the smell. A blend of sweat, sewage, livestock, and fried snacks. Because if you thought food trucks were a modern invention, Rome was way ahead of you. They had thermopolia, basically fast food joints carved right into the street. Counters lined with jars of hot stew, bread, beans, sausages, and the all-important garum, Rome's fermented fish sauce. It was like walking past a Taco Bell at 2 a.m., except the fish smell hit you first. These thermopolia were the salvation of the poor. Most Romans didn't have kitchens in their cramped apartments. They weren't roasting turkeys or slow-cooking roasts at home. Their apartments were wooden fire traps stacked like Jenga towers, where lighting a cooking fire was essentially signing your lease in ashes. So, dinner meant heading outside to the street vendors. Cheap bread, lentil stew, maybe a sausage if you had the cash, all washed down with watered wine. Because yes, wine was rarely drunk straight, it was considered barbaric. Romans mixed it with water to make it civilized. Picture ordering a beer today and the bartender dumping in half a pitcher of tap water. That was normal. But let's talk about garum. The beating heart, the sacred sludge of Roman cuisine. Imagine anchovies left in the sun to rot in vats of salt until they liquefy into a pungent, brownish goo. That goo was then bottled, shipped, and splashed on everything. Meat, fish, beans, even desserts. It was Worcestershire sauce without the dignity. Garum factories were the pride of coastal towns. Some were so profitable they made their owners rich enough to buy political office. Yes, in Rome, you could literally climb the ladder of power on a foundation of rotting fish. And don't wrinkle your nose too hard. Garum was addictive. Romans wrote poetry about it. They gave it as gifts. There were cheap versions for the masses and refined vintage blends for the elites, the way we treat wine today. You can almost imagine a pretentious Roman saying, "Ah yes, this amphora of garum has a particularly nuanced bouquet of mackerel." Street food wasn't all sludge and stew. There were snacks, fried pastries stuffed with cheese or honey, fritters sprinkled with poppy seeds, roasted nuts, olives, and fresh fruit. Vendors sold skewered meats sizzling over charcoal. Bakers churned out flatbreads so beloved that whole neighborhoods would smell like a pizza oven. And of course, wine flowed like a river. Sometimes spiced, sometimes warm, sometimes cheap enough to strip paint. Eating on the street was as much social as it was necessary. Crowds gathered around counters, shouting orders, leaning against walls, gossiping, arguing politics, making shady deals. The Thermopolium was a Roman Starbucks, minus the Wi-Fi, plus the constant risk of being pickpocketed. The class divide was glaring even in food. The rich feasted at banquets with exotic delicacies, peacock tongues, dormice stuffed with nuts, flamingo roasted whole. Meanwhile, the poor were thrilled with a bowl of watery porridge. Street food kept them alive, but it wasn't glamorous. And yet it was democratic. Everyone, from slave to senator, knew the taste of garum. Everyone drank watered wine. Food was a rare place where the classes overlapped, at least in flavor if not in presentation. Of course, there was a darker side. Fraud was rampant. Vendors padded their stews with more water than broth, reused oil until it was black sludge, sold meat that was questionable at best. Imagine buying a skewer of meat, only to realize it had been reheated 5 times and might have once belonged to a rat. Food poisoning wasn't just an occasional hazard, it was practically a rite of passage. Laws were passed to regulate vendors, but enforcement was spotty at best. And then there was outright crime. Thermopolia were hotbeds of gambling, prostitution, and drunken brawls. They were not just restaurants, they were hubs of vice, the dive bars of antiquity. Still, the culture around food was bigger than the food itself. Festivals turned Roman streets into carnivals of eating. Saturnalia, the December festival of role reversals, meant slaves feasting like masters, citizens stuffing themselves until they collapsed. Food was political theater. Emperors handed out free bread to the masses to keep them quiet, the famous bread and circuses. Distribute loaves, distract the people with games, and suddenly no one cares about corruption or collapsing aqueducts. It worked frighteningly well. A full stomach was the best propaganda tool. And you, strolling through these streets, would find it impossible to resist the pull. The smoke, the chatter, the promise of something warm and salty after a day of hauling water or bricks. Would it kill you later? Maybe. Would you eat it anyway? Absolutely. Because this was Rome, and survival meant filling your belly wherever you could. The street was your kitchen, your dining room, your bar, your entertainment. Every corner was alive with smells, voices, and flavors, an edible heartbeat of the empire. Funny thing is, when archaeologists dug up Pompeii, frozen in time under volcanic ash, they found Thermopolia almost exactly as they stood that day. Counters still painted with images of food, jars still stained with sauces, loaves of bread carbonized but recognizable. It's a reminder that Romans lived like us, grabbing lunch on the go, gossiping over snacks, complaining about prices, chasing comfort in familiar tastes. The street food of Rome wasn't glamorous, but it was human. And somehow, despite the centuries, we can still see ourselves standing there, licking garum off our fingers, swearing at the watered wine, and wondering if we'll regret it tomorrow. And just when you thought you could sit back with your garum-soaked bread and recover from the chaos of Roman street corners, history yanks you by the tunic and drags you forward into another kind of performance space, one not filled with bubbling vats of fish sauce but with the sound of plucked strings, pipes, and slightly off-key singing. Because food wasn't the only thing people craved for survival. They needed stories. They needed songs. They needed someone to stand in the drafty, echoing halls of medieval courts and remind them that life was not just a grim parade of taxes, plague, and confusing church decrees. Enter the minstrel. Imagine the bard from your favorite fantasy video game, only sweatier, hungrier, and a lot less likely to save the world with a magical lute solo. These performers were the Spotify playlists of the Middle Ages, and they walked into noble courts armed with nothing but rhymes, guts, and instruments that looked suspiciously like they had been stolen from a barn. Minstrels weren't just musical wallpaper. They were the emotional thermostats of the hall. If a lord wanted joy, the minstrel played something bright. If he wanted melancholy, out came the weepy ballads of lost love. If he wanted flattery, well, there were endless songs about how glorious his ancestors were, regardless of how incompetent they had actually been. And minstrels could pivot fast, like human mood rings in patched tunics. They filled silence with satire, slipped gossip into lyrics, or hurled playful insults dressed up as jokes. Everyone pretended to laugh, but let's be real, half of those jokes cut deeper than a sharpened dagger. Their toolkit was eclectic. Picture a minstrel walking in with a lute slung across their back, a small harp tucked under one arm, a recorder dangling from a rope, and maybe a drum under the other. They were one-person bands before it was trendy. The lute was the crowd pleaser, a pear-shaped string instrument that could whisper tender notes of longing or hammer out merry drinking songs. The vielle, a kind of proto-violin, was nasal, scratchy, and perfect for making your ears feel emotions you didn't know you had. Flutes, bagpipes, tambourines, and the occasional drum kept rhythm for dances or rowdier feasts. And of course, there were the vocals. Oh, the vocals. Imagine standing in a smoky hall, candlelight flickering off wooden beams, and some guy in a wool tunic belting out a story about Charlemagne's adventures like it's the top 40 hit of the season. But minstrels weren't all the same. There were categories. Troubadours in the south of France turned poetry and music into fine art, spinning elegant verses about courtly love that made knights sigh into their goblets. Their northern cousins, the trouvères, did much the same thing but with slightly different accents and an equally inflated sense of importance. Then you had jongleur, less refined, more flexible, part musician, part juggler, part comedian, part gossipmonger. A jongleur could tumble into the hall, spin 3 knives, sing a love song, recite the latest political rumor, and insult your hairstyle before you even finished your first drink. They were chaos wrapped in human form, adored and distrusted in equal measure. And lest you think it was all men strumming and joking, there were women too, the troubadours. They composed, performed, and stirred up the exact same mix of longing, flattery, and scandal as their male counterparts, but with the added spice of society clutching its pearls. Some noble women even became patrons, creating little hubs of creativity and scandal where songs and poetry blossomed. Imagine a medieval version of a songwriter's circle, except instead of sipping oat milk lattes, they were probably drinking watered wine and hoping the local abbot didn't show up to ruin the vibe. Their songs carried weight. They told stories of knights and ladies, of tragic battles, of saints and sinners. They could sneak in political messages, spreading propaganda disguised as entertainment. A clever minstrel might sing a ballad that made one duke look noble and another look like a toad, and suddenly everyone in the hall had picked a side. They were historians of the moment, capturing not just events but moods, whispers, and exaggerations that official records ignored. Which means if you want the raw gossip of the Middle Ages, don't dig through parchments in an archive, go find the verses. The minstrels were spilling the tea long before TikTok. Performances weren't just background noise at banquets. They were center stage. Picture a roaring feast, tables sagging under roasted meats, goblets overflowing, servants bustling. And there, in the midst of it, a minstrel commanding silence with a single note, spinning a tale that held the room captive. Or, on the other end of the spectrum, hammering out a rowdy drinking song while the entire hall banged cups on the table in rhythm, turning the night into a medieval frat party. They kept the energy up, the tempers soothed, the boredom at bay. Lords may have worn the crowns, but minstrels often steered the mood. But here's the part you'd probably fail at, dear viewer. Minstrels weren't living the glamorous life. Sure, they rubbed shoulders with nobles and sometimes got paid in silver, but more often they got a meal, a bed of straw, and the vague promise of, come back next time. Many wandered from town to town, enduring cold roads, bandits, and ungrateful audiences. They were news carriers as much as entertainers, spreading stories from one court to the next, keeping the fabric of culture stitched together across distances where most people never traveled beyond their village. Their reward? A little food, a little wine, maybe a coin or two, and the satisfaction of knowing they'd live rent-free in people's memories, until the next minstrel came along with a better song. And yet, despite the hardships, they carved out something lasting. Their melodies slipped into folk traditions, into church hymns, into the early seeds of Renaissance music. Their satirical spirit echoes in comedians, their romantic verses in pop ballads, their role as society's soundtrack in every artist who picks up a guitar today. If you've ever found yourself humming along to a song that makes you feel like you're in the middle of someone else's drama, congratulations, you've experienced the minstrel legacy firsthand. So imagine yourself, a weary traveler, sitting in some flickering hall, belly stuffed with questionable stew, when a minstrel steps forward, strums a lute, and launches into a tale. Suddenly, you're not thinking about taxes or plagues or how cold your feet are. You're leaning in, swept up in a story, laughing at the jabs, sighing at the love songs, gasping at the heroics. For a moment, you are part of something bigger, the shared heartbeat of an audience listening in unison. That was their power. Not armies, not laws, not bricks or banners, just words wrapped in melody, spilling into the night like warmth from a fire. Now picture the minstrel not in a glittering hall surrounded by roasted swans and velvet-draped nobles, but out on the road, shivering in the mud with a patched cloak and a lute that's missing 2 strings. Because here's the thing. For every minstrel who got to bask in candlelight and applause, there were dozens trudging between towns, trying to convince suspicious innkeepers that yes, they really did deserve a free meal in exchange for a song about Charlemagne's beard. Being a minstrel was less like being Taylor Swift and more like being that guy you see on the subway strumming Wonderwall for loose change. Only colder. Only hungrier. Only with a much higher chance of being mugged by actual bandits instead of ignored by commuters. These wandering performers were essential, though. Think of them as medieval Wi-Fi. They carried news, gossip, melodies, and scandals from one town to the next. A nobleman might never leave his castle walls, but thanks to a minstrel's songs, he knew about the battle lost 3 valleys over, or the scandalous affair happening in the next duchy. Stories traveled by foot and lute. And they weren't just carrying truth. They carried exaggerations, propaganda, rumors dressed as history. A minstrel could make you famous or infamous, depending on how many rhymes they could wring from your misfortune. Imagine being roasted in verse and realizing you couldn't delete it, couldn't sue, couldn't hide. The entire tavern was laughing, and you had no recourse but to glare into your ale. The road was brutal. Weather didn't care if you had a performance lined up in the next village. Rain-soaked parchment, warped instruments, and chilled fingers to the bone. Minstrels slept in barns, under hedges, or, if lucky, in the corner of a tavern where the smell of stale beer was at least warmer than the night air. Hunger was a constant companion. A half loaf of bread here, a bowl of thin stew there, maybe some scraps tossed by a patron who wasn't in the mood to pay in coins. And yet they kept walking, because the next town always promised another audience, another chance to be remembered. Not everyone welcomed them. Some towns saw wandering minstrels as suspicious, lumping them in with beggars, thieves, and troublemakers. Others feared the power of their songs. After all, words could spread rebellion faster than swords. A sharp verse mocking a tax collector could light a spark of resistance in the crowd. No wonder the church sometimes tried to clamp down on them, branding them as sinful, idle, dangerous. Which, let's be honest, only made the songs more appealing. Who doesn't want to hear the band track? But there were moments of magic. A firelit tavern packed with villagers, mugs raised high, stomping their feet to a rhythm that pulled everyone out of their daily grind. For a few hours, the whole room was united by melody and story. A lonely plowman, a weary maid, the surly miller, they were all swept into the same tale, laughing at the same punchlines, sighing at the same romances. In that moment, the minstrel wasn't poor, wasn't cold, wasn't desperate. They were the center of the universe, commanding attention, spinning joy from thin air. The road also allowed them to blend cultures. A tune picked up in Provence might end up in Flanders with new lyrics. A story from Italy could echo in England within a season, reshaped by each singer who carried it. They were remix artists before remixing was a thing, layering local flavor onto foreign notes, keeping traditions alive while inventing new ones. Without them, so many melodies would have been lost, swallowed by time. Instead, they wove a musical web that stretched across borders and centuries. And here's the funny part, you probably wouldn't last a single week in their boots. You think you'd enjoy the freedom, the open road, the romance of being a wandering storyteller? Sure, until you realize you're walking 20 miles in shoes that feel like medieval torture devices, your fingers are bleeding from plucking strings, and the only dinner you're getting is a questionable hunk of cheese that's been sweating in your pack for 3 days. Then you have to smile, tune your instrument, and charm a room full of strangers who might throw coins, or might throw cabbages. It's a gamble every time. Yet somehow they endured. Because the road gave them something castles never could, the hum of humanity. The thrill of reaching a new town, hearing a new dialect, learning a new joke. They thrived on that constant churn of faces, that endless opportunity to reinvent themselves. A minstrel in one town could be a prophet, in another a clown, in another a scandalous gossip. They lived a dozen lives in one. And from this chaos, legacies slipped quietly into place. Their songs seeded the folk traditions we still hum. Their tales seeded the literature that later generations wrote down. Their rhythms seeded the heartbeat of Europe's music. They were fragile, overlooked, often poor. But without them, entire strands of culture would simply vanish. So when you imagine them trudging down a muddy road, cloak flapping, lute clutched tight, think of what they carried. Not just instruments, not just lyrics, but the pulse of their world. They were walking archives, human playlists, carriers of memory. And every tavern, every court, every market square they passed through was just another chance to weave the people together with laughter, melody, and story. And so we come to the last echoes of the minstrel's song, the place where their footsteps fade into cobbled streets and their verses slip from memory into tradition. Because as fragile as they seemed, thin cloaks, cracked voices, wandering without roots, their influence proved remarkably stubborn. They outlived the lords they flattered, the taverns they performed in, and even the kingdoms whose banners they praised. Their melodies didn't die, they transformed. What was once sung to candlelight in drafty halls became the foundation of Renaissance polyphony. Their wandering refrains wove into the hymns that filled cathedrals, the folk songs that farmers hummed behind plows, the ballads that lovers whispered by firelight. Minstrels were like seeds scattered by the wind, most forgotten, but a few sprouting into whole forests of culture. Even when the courts began preferring more refined entertainment, they couldn't quite scrub away the minstrel spirit. Sure, by the 15th century, patrons were leaning towards structured compositions, professional choirs, and the sort of music that demanded trained precision instead of a scrappy jongler with a half-tuned lute. But you can hear it, the satire, the longing, the simplicity of a catchy refrain, still humming beneath the new layers of complexity. It's like hearing the faint beat of a drum sample in a modern remix and realizing the source was some folk song carried on muddy boots centuries before. Their legacy isn't just musical. They preserved attitudes, humor, and even courage. Think about satire. Every stand-up comedian today owes a quiet debt to those traveling songsters who dared mock knights and kings while dodging rotten vegetables. Every pop ballad crooning about impossible love has a faint trace of troubadour sighing woven into it. Even protest songs, the anthems of rebellion, carry the same din, words strung to melody, designed to slip past defenses and lodge in hearts. The tools haven't changed. The stakes haven't changed. Only the costumes and the audiences. It's tempting to imagine them as quaint relics, plucking harps in smoky halls, but the truth is they were dangerous. Words are weapons, and minstrels knew how to aim them. A catchy verse could topple reputations, a satirical jab could stir unrest, a romantic ode could ignite scandal. That's why they were alternately courted, feared, banned, and celebrated. That's why their memory survived. Not because they were harmless entertainers, but because they tapped into something raw and universal. They voiced what people felt but couldn't always say out loud. They were society's chorus, and no ruler could silence that forever. Would you survive as one? Honestly, doubtful. You'd stumble after a week of sore feet, cracked lips, and impatient audiences demanding you play their favorite tune for the 30th time. You'd balk at the uncertain pay, the thin beds of straw, the constant hunger. And yet, if you could endure it, you'd discover something strangely powerful. You discover that the simple act of making people laugh, cry, or hum along could give you more influence than an army of soldiers. You'd learn that memory is more precious than money, and that being sung about, even badly, meant you lived on in ways wealth could never buy. And that's really the thread connecting all the parts of our journey tonight, isn't it? From the Roman legionary breaking his back in armor, to Marco Polo trudging across deserts, to the Roman street vendor ladling stew, to the minstrel wandering muddy roads with a lute. Survival wasn't just about food, or steel, or coin. It was about legacy, about leaving something behind. Soldiers left walls and scars. Merchants left stories. Cooks left flavors. Minstrels left songs. Each one stitched themselves into the human story, so that centuries later we can sit here, laugh about garum, wince at the legion's drills, marvel at Polo's exaggerations, and hum along to echoes of a forgotten tune. So the next time you catch yourself listening to music, or grabbing takeout, or daydreaming about far-off lands, know this: you're walking in very old footsteps. The legionary, the explorer, the vendor, the minstrel, they're all still here, quietly shaping the way we live. You probably wouldn't survive a day in their lives. But because they did, you don't have to. All you have to do is listen, eat, wander, and maybe hum a tune. History has already done the hard part for you. And with that, if you've made it this far, give yourself a round of applause, or at least a like on the video. Subscribe if you haven't already, drop a comment about which part of this bizarre human journey fascinated you most, and maybe hum a ballad to yourself before bed. Because history may be messy, smelly, violent, and absurd, but it always sings.